All right, it's 12 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. There's a quick reminder up here about our 7th annual Shark Tank competition, which is coming up, so please scan that QR code. As a reminder, all of our grand rounds this year are eligible for CME and MOC credit, so you go ahead and use this to go ahead and get your credits. And I'll just say welcome to everyone who's here in person. Really happy that you are here. We will continue broadcasting via Zoom all year long to increase our audience. But a lot of our questions will come from our live audience. And thank you to our chief medical residents who will be watching the Q&A feature. If you have a question for Dr. Homo, please use the Q&A feature. A little bit of a teaser, upcoming talks. On April 12th, we're going to hear from our own Dr. Larry Moreland, who's going to give an update on rheumatoid arthritis treatment strategies. And then on April 17th, we're going to welcome a special guest. It's Mr. Felipe Sands. He is a renowned author. He's also an international human rights lawyer, as well as a professor of law at the Royal College of London, who's going to be our speaker for our annual Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics program, and that's on April 17th. I will do a quick introduction for Dr. Homo before he gets started, but before we do that, I want to turn this over to Dr. Mark Ernest.
Thanks, Jeff. And for all of you who aren't here, I just want you to know this is the first time we've had a lobster buffet for lunch.
Yeah, it's really
so I would encourage you to come. I understand that's just going to improve from here, right?
Standard,
okay.
Yes.
Well, it is my pleasure to introduce the annual Bertel Lecture. You see a picture in front of you of Bob Bertel, much as I remember him when I came here as an intern. So Dr. Bertel was recruited by Dr. Gordon Micklejohn, who was really the founder of the modern Department of Medicine. Dr. Bertel was a general internist and to some degree, Dr. Micklejohn's right-hand man. So at the time Dr. Bertel was recruited, there was not such a thing as a division of academic general internal medicine. He provided the leadership to create what became one of the first academic departments or divisions of general internal medicine, and one that has provided leadership to the country ever since. The Department of Family Medicine was actually created within the Department of Medicine, and Dr. Bertel led that. So he was actually the first chair of the Department of Family Medicine. So a real leader with incredible impact institutionally and for the field's primary care, academic primary care across the country. Of all the things he did and the roles he played, the one I think he was proudest of and would consider his biggest impact was his role as a teacher. And so when he passed away a number of years ago, his family very generously gave a gift to create this lectureship. And every year we remember Dr. Bertel, and it gives us the opportunity to bring to the campus a national thought leader who can help us think about very intentionally, as Dr. Bertel did, about our education and about where we should be going in the future with it. So, so just a moment to remember the legacy of Dr. Bertel.
I'll also say thank you to Dr. Bertel, to the legacy, to his family who are here today. We really do appreciate this. And without Dr. Bertel and his efforts, we would not be able to welcome Dr. Eric Humboldt to campus today. Dr. Humboldt told me that I had to cut this down and make it incredibly short, so 1/100th of what I have written here. But he is a renowned physician, an educator, who really has made incredible contributions to the field of medical education and assessment across his career. He currently serves, and this is the role that many of you probably know him for, as the Chief of Research Milestones Development and the Chief Evaluation Officer at the ACGME, a position he's held for a number of years. Prior to joining the ACGME, he was the Chief Medical Officer and Senior Vice President for the ABIM. And so this is something he has been dedicated his career to for quite some time. Throughout his career, he's been a leading voice in medical education, and particularly in the assessment of competence. Before all of that, he was an intern in the Navy. He was a resident at Yale. He was an APD in their primary care program. So he knows what a lot of us do as educators. And so I will just end there and say, welcome to Dr. Eric Humboldt.
Well, first, thanks so much for having me. And again, what a treat to meet part of Dr. Bertel's family. So it's a real honor to be with you today. And I hope this will be helpful. I'm going to talk about competency-based medical education, but I'm going to talk about it through the lens of this concept called co-production, which I think can be partners on the road to educational transformation. I'm now in the latter stages of my career. I've been very fortunate. I do think a lot of things have improved since the time I was an APD. That was 20 years ago at Yale. I was also a training officer in the Navy back in the early 90s. And so watching this kind of evolution, although it sometimes feels slow, has been occurring. And I think Colorado has been at the forefront of much of that. And so thank you for that. Just real quickly, these are my disclosures. By the way, if anybody's thinking of writing a textbook as a retirement strategy based on royalties, please come see me. Okay, so here's the outline. I'm going to first take a look back. Well, then we'll talk about a brief review of what I call the key components of competency-based medical education. And then we'll talk about what's co-production and why it's important. And we'll talk about what that means for our learners. And so just a show of hands, how many residents are in the room? Awesome. Yeah, so I'm really looking to you because as I said, I'm getting older and I know I'm going to need your services at some point. And so I got a real vested interest in making sure that the education system works. And then we'll talk about some practical suggestions moving forward. I also do want to start with a thank you. It's been a really difficult 3 years. The pandemic has just had a profound impact across the globe. It's now estimated that somewhere between 20 to 22 million people have lost their lives due to COVID. Officially, in the United States, it's over 1.1 million. And we've also gone through various stages of this pandemic that have really affected and buffeted our healthcare workforce. On the left is a somewhat sobering mural created by a Mexican artist back in the spring of 2020. These are 198 healthcare workers who lost their lives to COVID in those early phases before we had vaccines and other therapies. So she created that mural by creating their pictures. Unfortunately, as the pandemic has progressed, we've also seen the rise of misinformation. And some of that misinformation has led to less than optimal behaviors that have affected you as our healthcare workers. And I'm very sorry for that. And so you've really, kind of borne this burden of, taking care of very sick individuals, not always fully supported by the public, and having to buffet those kind of challenges with the misinformation and yet the very hard work that you've all done. So thank you for the care that you've provided these past 3 years. What's interesting, the pandemic also has exposed several, I think, challenges for med ed. One of the things that we've used for a long period of time, and guilty as charged, as you heard, I worked at a certification board, is that we rely a lot on what we call proxies. And a number of those proxies for competence were significantly altered and disrupted, not the least of which is the usual proxy of volume, how many rotations you had, how many patients you saw, and then the distribution of that experience, right, such as procedures. That was all greatly affected and reduced during the pandemic. Some of the rotations that were typically scheduled did not occur. This is particularly true for medical students that were pulled out of clinical spaces, not able to do certain electives, and therefore had a very different experience coming into residency. And even high stakes exam got affected. As you know, the clinical skills exam was first suspended by the National Board of Medical Examiners and then ultimately dropped, returning the responsibility to examine clinical skills back to the schools. It also highlighted that our transitions, which have never been as systematic as I think they need to be, were further disrupted. So moving from medical school into graduate medical education residency became more difficult, partly because you didn't have these experiences that you typically counted on in that fourth year or third year. There was a group of organizations, including ours, that tried to create what's called a transition toolkit to try to help support learners. By the way, learners were actually part of the team that created that toolkit. But we also saw difficulty from residency to fellowship and then from residency fellowship out into practice. And so these transitions got exposed as needing to be more systematic. And that, by the way, has been called out through reports some of you may be familiar with by the Coalition for Physician Accountability, really saying we have to spend much more time thinking about these transitions in the continuum. Not a big surprise, there were further exposed gaps in assessment, particularly what I like to call the other competencies, the non-patient care medical knowledge. They matter, turns out they matter a lot, and yet they're still lagging attention and also got short shrift during the pandemic. And then unfortunately, we've seen kind of an exacerbation of not only just implicit bias, but just outright explicit bias, prejudice, and so forth. Some of that, unfortunately, coming from the public and patients and so forth, has made it very difficult in the care environment. So as we kind of hopefully get on the other side of this pandemic, if you will, understanding that the effects of it will be with us for a long time, a lot of folks are kind of turning their attention back to claim, like, what does this mean? How can we take the lessons of what's just happened in the last 3 years and accelerate the adoption of what's called outcomes-based education? And so let's first start with a definition. Its central tenet is simply you start with the end in mind. In other words, what is it you want your graduates to honestly be able to do? Not if they just completed 36 months of training as an IM, but literally what is it they can do at the end of that training period? Because those outcomes really define what the structure and processes of training should be. And Ed Ron Harden, who's been a wonderful educationalist now for decades, just recently retired in his 80s, pointed out that educational outcomes also have to be clearly and unambiguously specified, right? They can't be nebulous, and that's been a challenge for us. Because as he points out, these educational outcomes, as I said, will affect what you design for curriculum, the assessment processes you use, and also the learning environment. How important it is we put folks in a learning environment that's supportive, psychologically safe, and provides them with the experiences they're going to need to acquire the competencies and abilities they need. And so as we think about the ultimate goal of medical education, in other words, the ultimate outcome, we've also seen an evolution of this. The ultimate outcome is an attainment of what's now called the quintuple aim. It started out as a triple aim from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, really focused on the population health, looking at the quality of care that was delivered, called experience of care, and then making that an affordable cost, or per capita cost, and reducing cost. More recently, Krasinski and Tom Bodenheimer, created this concept of the quadruple aim, where we need to care to your well-being because, again, burnt out physicians, tired physicians, honestly don't provide us high quality care. You can't. There are just limits to what humans can do. And more recently, folks have now argued in a recent article in the JAMA is that really we should call out health equity as its own aim, even though it's embedded in the original Institute for Medicine's Crossing the Quality Chasm report, now Academy of Medicine. We need to make that more explicit given the pandemic's exposed those disparities even further. And if you look at the disparities, what happened with regard to maternal mortality and et cetera, it's pretty sobering, the kind of gap that's opened up between the different groups. And in order to do that, we have to think about our training programs as this kind of integrated ongoing loop. You've probably heard the adage that assessment drives learning. That's true, but learning should drive the right type of assessment. And really being very selective and deliberate when we do assessment, that should be attached to the goals of what that curricular experience is. The competency should guide that curriculum, and then we need to define what educational outcomes look like. That's what the entrustable professional activities and milestones are for, and we're continuing to work on that. And this all, as I said, has to occur within a high-functioning clinical learning environment. And that's been the purpose of the CLEAR program, is to really help institutions understand what their environment looks like for the purpose of improvement. So as we think about outcomes-based medical education, how do we operationalize that, right, or implement it? That's where competency-based medical education comes into play. And there's been, I think, some nice work done, and I think some of it's held up pretty well. This is from 2010. This is an international consortium that got together to try to come up with a working definition. This project was led by the Royal College in Canada and Jason Frank and his colleagues, bringing different perspectives from across the globe. And in the end, in this 2010 article, they defined CBME as an approach to preparing physicians for practice that is fundamentally oriented to graduate outcome abilities and organized around competencies derived from an analysis of societal and patient needs, right? That's where we need to start, and we work back. CBME de-emphasizes time-based training. Jeff and I just had this interesting conversation about that, and promises greater accountability, flexibility, and learner-centeredness. Now, unfortunately, a lot of folks, when they see this definition, immediately go to like, oh, this is all about shortening training. No, that is actually not the primary purpose of CBME. It is a possible dividend. It is not the ultimate goal. Here's the fundamental difference in CBME using the concept of time. In CBME, time is viewed as a resource and not an intervention or measure. In other words, not a proxy, right? Think about internal medicine. We use time, 36 months, with X number of months on the wards, X number of months in the ICU, X number of months in the ED, as a proxy for competence, believing that if you have that amount of experience, you're good to go. That was my residency. And don't get me wrong, I loved my residency. I wouldn't change it for the world. But that was essentially, as long as I checked that box off and nothing bad happened during that month, I could add that to my kind of, Lego collection. And at the end, as long as I had 36 Lego pieces, I was good to go. So shortening training is not the primary goal. Time should be used wisely, and the amount of training time required to be based on the outcomes desired. Now, within our current system here in the US, I think it's very difficult to basically make this a kind of standard policy. We are stuck for a number of reasons with fixed time because of financing, because again, most of GME, particularly in residency, is financed by CMS and so forth. But I do think we have the opportunity to innovate and create flexibility within that 3 years that can really help folks continually develop without holding them back. And so how do we get there? If that's CBME, what are the kind of key elements or components? This was work led by Elaine Van Mel from Queen's University in Canada, and I find this really helpful. Again, it's not the totality, but it gives us a framework to really think about CBME. And it's called the Core Components Framework. And there are 5 core components. The first is you need an outcomes competency framework, and that the competencies or abilities required for practice are clearly articulated. We have that. It's still a work in progress, but the 6 general competencies, believe it or not, have actually held up quite well. When you look at the science and what supports each of them, there's good science behind them. The second is called sequence progression, where these competencies and their developmental markers are sequenced progressively based on where the learner is and what their needs are. And then the last 3 columns are tailored learning experiences, competency-focused instruction, and programmatic assessment using a systems lens where learning experiences facilitate, teaching practices promote, and assessment practices support and document the developmental acquisition of the competencies. You'll notice that in 4 out of the 5 columns, the word developmental. And I think for us, this is a mind shift, that this isn't just something you kind of, click off along the way, but it's an intensely developmental process. And we have to think that way when we're designing programs. And so here's what it looks like as a schematic from Elaine, where the outcome competencies and sequence progression forms the core. And then the things around it support it, right? Programmatic assessment, competency-focused instruction, and tailored learning experiences. And of course, community needs and societal needs and influences will affect this process. We know that. Unfortunately, some of it, right now is actually legislative. It's having a major impact on some of our training programs, not the least of which is OBGYN at the moment, really struggling in some states about how they're going to be able to operationalize this. But each community needs are different based on the population that it serves and who's there as part of that population. The other reason I really like this framework is it's actually grounded in what's called a growth mindset. How many people familiar with Carol Dweck's work? It's kind of the name folks recognize. Yeah, she's written some nice books, but this is actually a body work, believe it or not. This is kind of depressing for me. It's been going on for over 40 years. And so we've learned a lot. But I think it's really important because a growth mindset really is about development. And having this mindset then forms the basis for significantly redesigning assessment practices, instructional methods, and learning experience. That figure to the right is what our current architecture looks like in internal medicine training. If you look at that, it's a bunch of rotations with varying topics or kind of conditions embedded within them, where we have kind of this weekly ambulatory clinic. That's the structure. And the question is, does that structure really support professional growth? And I offer that as a question to all of you. The second is that it really is focused on promoting learner growth and development through frequent formative assessment. Formative assessment is really feedback for learning, right? It's assessment for the purpose of helping folks get better. And it's what it should be for. And so that's a figure on the right from a nice last page article from Academic Medicine of the Kolb's learning cycle. If you haven't looked at it, I would encourage you. It's a really nice article. And so the aspects in green there, what's needed for assessment in order to support that learning cycle. So David Kolb did a lot of work around the learning cycle back in the 70s and 80s, and that's actually held up pretty well. It also has to be rich in feedback and coaching, individualized to the learner and grounded in the desired competencies. You have a coaching expert here in Tyra. I had a wonderful session with her this morning, talking about the work that she's doing, kind of thinking about it more broadly. But what I show you on the right here is a really nice model built by Joan Sargent at Dalhousie called the R2C2 model, about what really the feedback process should look like, being more of a conversation with the learner. In the end, really figuring out what's best to help them be successful in moving things forward. And then finally, it has to provide rich and diverse learning experiences steeped in clinical practice where the learners can stay as long as required to achieve the outcomes. Again, that's where the time variability comes in. It's not about shortening. It's about using enough time, using it as a resource to make sure the folks are truly ready. So what I want you to do is I want you to find a partner, and I want you to spend about 3 to 4 minutes talking about how would you judge the internal medicine program here. And I hope, Jeff, this is okay. Conversation? Okay. You and I can have a therapy session afterwards, or maybe I will connect you with Tyra. To judge your training program's effectiveness in those 5 core components, and I will put them back up for you. But I want you to really have a conversation, like, where do you think you are as a program? And learners, if possible, I'd like you not to talk to another learner, another resident. I want you to find a faculty member and talk to a faculty member, okay? So let's do that for about 3 to 4 minutes. So let's go ahead and regroup. So I hope that was helpful. And now what we're going to do is we're going to spend just a little bit more time on those middle three columns, the progressive sequencing and then the tailoring of learning and teaching, about actually why that's so important and kind of where that came from, what the science is behind that. And so I won't spend a lot of time in this slide. I'm going to highlight those things in red. But one of the things I want folks to understand about CBME, and I love the way Elaine kind of phrases this, it's a deeply evidence-informed approach with decades of research in these various elements, such as expertise theory, mastery-based learning, deliberate practice, self-regulated learning, coaching theory, and growth mindset. We've talked a little bit about coaching and growth mindset. I'm going to cover some of the others throughout the rest of the talk. But understand this isn't just something somebody made up. You know, this is an amalgam of a lot of educational theory and empiric research that has informed the core components that really have been shown to improve educational outcomes. Many of these, by the way, have been originally studying K through 12 education and found to make a difference. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of these. I'm going to start with what's called a stage model development and striving for expertise. You may be familiar with this work. It's Hubert and Stuart Dreyfus. They began this work in the 1970s. Interestingly, anybody know what the catalyst was for Hubert and Stuart to begin this work? Why they started working in this area? It's kind of fascinating. So Hubert, by the way, was a philosopher, and Stuart was an electrical computer engineer. And their big concern was, wait for it, was that artificial intelligence was taking attention away from the importance of human development. 1973, 50 years ago. And so they realized that we have to attend to that. And part of their original work was done, believe it or not, with the Air Force. How is it you can take a kind of awkward, 25-year-old male and stick him in a piece of machinery that flies at twice or 3 times the speed of sound? How does that happen? And that's where they started, and they've since been explored in many other fields, obviously, such as medicine. And these are the stages. You don't move through these in a nice stepwise fashion, but they provide a description about what we look like and we're able to do at these stages that can be helpful in guiding our educational and developmental process. This is an example around clinical reasoning. Our ultimate goal for you, the residents, is to get you to proficiency within this kind of stage model by the time you graduate. And you can see here in clinical reasoning that you're able to use very efficiently what's called non-analytic and dual process thinking. If you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work and others, you're comfortable with evolving situations. The senior residents, you're the ones often dealing with uncertainty and ambiguity, and you're really helping your junior learners to understand that as you're working through a diagnostic process. You're able to extrapolate from previous experience to current experience. You have what's called situational discrimination. And guess what? You can live with ambiguity, which I think we all know as an internist. If you can't do that, you're gonna struggle, right? Ambiguity and uncertainty is a big part of what we do. Another really important body of work is called deliberate practice. One of the leaders in this, best known to medicine, is a gentleman named Anders Ericsson, who we sadly lost unexpectedly in the spring of 2020. But Anders spent a lifetime really studying how folks become experts. And what he found was this concept of deliberate practice was essential. And no matter what field he looked like, this was always in play. And deliberate practice is simply individualized training activities, especially designed by a coach or teacher, there's those words again, to improve specific aspects of an individual's performance through repetition and successive refinement. This is not a see one, do one, teach one type process, okay? Despite what we've taught, certainly I was in my era. And what Anders noted that it really requires a field or a discipline that is well developed and that there are clear mental representations of the task. And they're shared among those who are doing the coaching and teaching. And without those shared mental model or clear mental representations, that creates real challenges for us. Another really important concept that's also got more attention recently, although it's been around for a long time, is called mastery-based learning. One of the leaders in this field is Bill McGahey, who, believe it or not, was a young postdoc working with George Miller, a famous educationalist, and was the first author on a World Health Organization white paper advocating to use competency-based medical education as the model with the mastery mindset. Anybody know when that white paper was published? That would be 1978. Okay. And so Bill, more recently working with his colleagues, have been using this when a lot of their simulation work. And the mindset here, I think, is important. Excellence is expected and achievable by all learners who are able, motivated, and work hard. In a mastery mindset, there is little to no variation in measured outcomes. So again, I had a good conversation, opportunity to talk with Jeff and Brandon about this from a procedural, right, and training and procedures. There really should be little variation in that particular skill set. And learning in any domain depends on learning a sequence of less complex components. And if learners receive optimal quality of instruction and learning time required, the majority of learners should attain mastery. This isn't about the floor. This isn't about good enough. It's getting everybody up to the highest level of performance possible for the benefit not only of their careers, but for patients. And this is why all this is so important. This is what a learning curve actually looks like. If you haven't read Martin Pusik's work, I'd strongly recommend it. But learning curves are sigmoidal. And so all of you as residents, guess what? You're on the steep part of that curve the entire time you will be here at Colorado. All right, that's the nature of what we do. Medical students, obviously, it's steep part of the curve and the early part of that curve. And so our goal is to get you to proficiency. Is kind of where we want you to be, but you'll notice that you're not done. That when you leave Colorado onto whatever it is, a fellowship, or you become a hospitalist and so forth, there is work to be done. If you want to become a deliberate expert, you have to engage in deliberate practice continually to do that, to attain mastery. And the competencies simply provide a framework to help guide that journey. They're not the totality of internal medicine. As I said, they're mostly a guide. And guess what? Not everybody's learning curve looks the same. So this is from that same article. And this is actually a pretty simple example. What Martin did is he had 18 pediatric residents while they were rotating through the emergency department read a whole series of ankle radiographs. Some were normal, some had lesions, developmental lesions, some had fractures and so forth. And you can see as a group on the left that as a group, there's a steep part of the curve where they're getting more accurate. And then there's gradual improvement, very much like what I just showed you. But as I'm sure you've noticed, if you shift your gaze to the right, those are the 18 individual patterns. And they all look a bit different. There are a few residents who are actually pretty good at this, but because they're only getting feedback on right or wrong, no coaching, they plateau. Right? Even though it's a plateau at 80% accuracy, they weren't able to get better. And then there are others, despite reading over 200 films, still can only get to about 2/3 accuracy. And this is not to say like, well, they're much better and these aren't. It's like, no, everybody's a little different. They come in with different skill sets. And we have to tailor our instruction to help those that may be struggling a bit more to figure out what techniques they need to improve the reading. Now, some of you may think like, yeah, I know, but AI is just going to take care of this. They're going to read the films for us. So why are we looking at this? It's really meant to describe a principle because there are other things I'll show in a moment where we do see this kind of variability. And so in reality, I'm going to show you what the education system is producing. These slides honestly might be a bit uncomfortable. So we look at the milestone data every year. This is internal medicine from last summer, the first time the milestones 2.0 are reported. And this is evidence-based practice and ethical principles. And the good news is the vast majority were judged by the program's understanding it's a judgment, and judgments aren't perfect, to be at level 4 proficiency or above. But you can notice that there's a whisker, which typically represents about 10% of the residents. And then the circles represent what are called outliers. And those are groupings of residents that really struggled, including residents at the time they theoretically were graduating were deemed to have not even reached level 1. Okay, and things like ethical principles. Now, I honestly don't know what happened to these individuals, and that's deliberate because we don't look at individuals at the ACGME, right? We use this data for purposes of improvement. But I would argue, I would worry about those folks as they go into practice. Are they going to struggle? Did they need more time? Or did they not get an intervention earlier in their training that could have been helpful to them to help fill the gaps in these particular competencies? This is something that's hot off the press. This is will be soon available. It's been accepted by JAMA Network Open. But what we looked at were ratings in milestones in professionalism and communication scores against a registry that's housed at Vanderbilt University. This registry looks at patient complaints, and this registry is about 15 years old and has found correlation with state medical board actions, but has also found connections with outcomes of patients, including complications. And what you can see that using 4 as the reference standard, because that's the goal, if you scored below 4, you were at greater risk for having serious complaints in the first 3 years of practice. So this wasn't like 10 years down the road. This is early practice. And beginning to find that, again, our purpose here is not to say like, oh, these are terrible. It's like, you know what? If you are providing these ratings to your trainees, and this is a penultimate rating I'm showing you, this is with 6 months to go, take it seriously and figure out what's happening with that resident so that you can intervene to help them. See if there's something you can do. For example, if they need to improve their communication skills, because remediation works, right? And it shouldn't be a dirty word, right? We all have gaps. There's all things we can get better at, but this goes to show you that there are real world consequences when folks come out not sufficiently prepared. This is another study based on where folks train. This is by Candace Chen. This is looking at primary care physicians, including internists. And what they found is that if you trained in a high cost environment, right, based on HRR kind of measures, it turned out that you remained a high cost provider once you graduated from that institution. And what was also kind of sobering about this is that this is just the region where they trained. It wasn't even specific to their institution. These are what are called health resource regions. And what was also interesting is that this effect for those who trained in the highest cost institutions, the association between where they trained and how long they stayed a high cost provider was as long as 15 years. And so I refer to this as the reverse Vegas rule. What happens here at Colorado will not stay at Colorado. But I actually think that's a good thing, right? We can leverage that for good. So if folks are really well prepared, they'll take that good stuff with them. And we have evidence. I could show you other evidence, but that's the good news here in this particular study. This one's a little more sobering. This is recently presented at our outcomes conference. This is incredible work by Jesse Raffel, an internist at NYU. What he took a look at is there's actually a CMS database where you can look at prescribing habits and prescriptions among practicing docs for Medicare patients. This is open access. And so what he did is he then looked to see where folks trained, and he only looked, and these are internal medicine and family medicine residencies, and they had to have at least 10 residents in the database so that there wouldn't be a skew if they had just a few. And so you can see in total, we were able to look at 842 programs. And if you look on the right, you can see the distribution of opiate prescribing behavior. And these are Medicare patients. And this is after we've adjusted for all the comorbidities. If they were in a hospice and palliative care code, they were excluded and so forth. And you see there are real outlier programs where the majority of their graduates are going out and are high prescribers of opiates, right? Something we know to put those patients at risk. And so again, we look at this not as a punitive lens, but we're working to figure out how we can feed this back to these programs and say, hey, your graduates are really prescribing opiates at a very high rate. They're real outliers. Take a look at your curriculum. What's happening during training? Is there something that they're being inculcated with that may have these inadvertent effects? Okay. And so I love this quote, attributed to a number of folks, but actually was really first promoted in quality improvement by Paul Batalden and picked up by Don Berwick. But, as Paul said, every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And so we have multiple examples of fixed time GME persistently producing variable outcomes. So for all of our angst about time variability, we're producing variable outcomes. And my question to all of us is this really what we want? I think I know the answer. It's a rhetorical question, I hope, that we don't, right? And that's the purpose of trying to continually transform and improve our educational programs. So how do we get there? This is where I think co-production can be really helpful. And so this is the reality of what it's like when we're in a training situation. We want to make sure the patient's at the center, but we have lots of interactions and interdependencies that occur in the care of that patient. The learners working with the patient, with the faculty, obviously there's the healthcare team, all the other interprofessionals are critical to good care. The training program has an interaction with the various patients. And I would argue we increasingly need to think about educational and healthcare outcomes as essentially one and the same. And I just showed you evidence of that, right? So our educational outcomes should be tied tightly to how well we're providing care. And if we begin to think about that and attend to these interdependencies and see them as a good thing, I think that can help move things forward. And co-production is a mindset that can help us with that. This is a definition from Paul Batalden, published in BMJ Quality Safety, where he said, co-production is the interdependent work of users and professionals to design, create, develop, deliver, assess, and improve the relationships and actions that contribute to the health of individuals and populations. Co-production is about service. I think this is a really important point, right? So is medical education. We don't make products. I hate referring to our learners as a product of the program. You are a professional that we're preparing to provide service. And when we talk about service, two parties are always involved in making a service. And it's important to recognize both parties bring expertise. For our residents, you bring expertise into this training program. Part of that expertise is your lived experience, which matters a lot. But there are going to be things you know that I do not. You've been trained in certain things that I never got during my medical school. That's expertise. We want you to use it. And services, when performed well, are always co-produced. Richard Norman is a Swedish economist that Paul had a chance to work with. Fascinating guy. He's written some interesting books, but he highlights the importance of what he calls a service logic. That is forcing a shift of attention from production to utilization, from product to process, and from transaction to relationship. Okay? That's what we're really trying to accomplish. And this is what it looks like for clinical care. This is from Maren Batalden and the crew, also published in BMJ, where they argue that patients with professionals should co-execute, co-plan through civil discourse, something sorely missing, I think, today in many ways, to co-produce high-value healthcare for all and good health for all. Notice that in this diagram, patients are on the exact same horizontal plane as the professionals. It's deliberately non-hierarchical because patients are partners. They're embedded within a healthcare system and they're embedded within community and society. There's actually wonderful examples of this. One of the best in the United States is in the care of children with cystic fibrosis. Jeff, you don't get to answer this because you're a pulmonologist. But who is the most important healthcare professional in the care of a patient with CF? You got it. It's mom. It's almost always mom. Sometimes dad, but let's be honest, it's mom. But it's the parent. You don't want the child in the hospital. The whole goal is to give them a healthy life so they don't have to be in the hospital. But when they're in the hospital, I can tell you University of Cincinnati, which is an exemplar here, parents can stay in the room. And when the team comes around on the child, the parent joins the team as a team member and helps to co-plan what's going to happen with that child that day. And also begin to prepare them for the transition back home, right? I think that's such a wonderful mindset. Well, what if we use the same mindset for education, where we see learners and teachers on the same horizontal plane, co-executing, co-planning through civil discourse, high-value learning in clinical care at the same time, bringing those overlap, those Boolean circles I showed you earlier, closer together, right? Of course, this is embedded within the health professions, educational system, and community, but that's the goal, right? So I use this co-production mindset in education. I think has lots of opportunities. And Bob Englander, who's another pediatrician, led a group to really compare and contrast what that means versus our traditional approaches on what a co-production model looks like. I would argue in the traditional hierarchical kind of model, medicine, by the way, is a very hierarchical profession. It's been mostly a goods model, learner's product. Where here in a service model, learners becomes a service provider. The primary driver used to be the teacher, right? The sage on the stage. Now we want a learner-teacher partnership where the teacher becomes more a guide on the side, right? To support that learning. The focus in the past has been really input what we call input focus. What's the sequence of your rotations, X number of rotations, X number of courses. Oh, by the way, you might throw some grades in there. Whereas in a co-production model, learner and teacher are both experts in context and content respectively, and they leverage each other's strengths to improve the educational process. With regard to information ownership in the past, and I remember this, from my time, the medical school owned my assessment data. The residency owned my assessment data. No, they don't, right? The ownership is the learner. The learner really should be the ultimate owner of that information. Again, I'm going to quote Don Berwick here because I love this phrase, nothing about me without me, right? If you're doing this, I have a right to understand what's happening to me. And ideally, if this were part of a portfolio process, you could take it with you to your next stage of career and build on that to help you in your professional growth. In the relationship between our different professions, as you know, we've been very siloed, still a challenge. Ultimately, that has become much more integrated. Not only basic and clinical science, but also system science. And I'm absolutely ecstatic that you're building a health sciences curriculum here. I had a chance to meet with that team yesterday. Thank you for that. And then the connections we've already talked about, we need clear transitions. And maybe they're variable time based on where folks are. We know this is possible. Bob Engler at Minnesota actually has proven this. He's done it through what's called the EPEC program. Orthopedics in Toronto did the same thing and so forth. And then ultimately, we also have to really get out of a blame and shame model. And this really has to become a continuous improvement. And so one of the ways we can do that is to think it back to our kind of Kolb learning cycle and go back and think of that learning cycle as a co-production cycle. So we start with kind of assessment. We co-assess together, right? So right after a CCC meeting, I compare and contrast my self-assessment with the CCC thought. Where am I doing well? Where are there discordance? Let's use that as an opportunity to kind of figure out where I am. And then let's decide on next steps. That's where the individualized learning plan is critical. And that needs to be designed with the learner. One of the things that's always frustrating about assessment is I would argue assessment is too often something we do to learners instead of something we do with them. And the more we can shift to the with them, the better, right? I think we'll be much better off because ultimately it's for their benefit. We're trying to help them be as successful as possible. And then as they go out and work on things, we co-deliver that. Faculty, mentors, advisors support them through that process. And this is a cyclic activity that will go on repeatedly throughout the training program. And so what does the learner need to really fully engage in co-production? These are the kind of skills they need. They need to really learn how to do reflective practice, not an easy thing to do. Self-regular learning, embrace a growth mindset. We have to create the conditions for that. They need to seek out assessment, but it needs to be psychologically safe to do that. They need to create those individualized learning plans. And ultimately, they do have to have accountability and ownership, right? In the end, we can't be competent for them as faculty. That's something that they obviously have to do. And so one of the things that changed with Milestones 2.0 is this was added. Reflective practice and commitment to personal growth. To really make sure explicitly that folks are working on this as an ability because you're going to need this when you're out in practice. You won't have Jeff as a training program or the program director always, kind of overseeing everything, monitoring, making things every okay. You're going to have to be self-directed, and reflective practice is an essential skill to do that. This is a nice slide from Sarita Soares at Yale, really talking about the self-regulated learning and the cycle that goes along with that. Again, something you need to learn how to do. On the left are kind of the key elements, understanding it is a cyclical feedback loop. You have to be self-motivated. You have to engage in goal setting. And then you have to also be able to self-monitor. How am I doing? Am I on track or not? And then the cycle is that ability to reflect and adapt, plan and set goals, and then use strategies and monitor performance. And that's always an ongoing cycle, right? We're always working to get better. These are the learner roles and responsibilities in co-production. Again, learn and apply reflective practice and self-regulated learning, engage in informed self-assessment, actively contribute to their learning portfolio, create the individualized learning plan in partnership with faculty, and seek feedback from interprofessional team members, not just faculty, but from nurses, discharge planners, other folks who are critical to the success of caring for a patient. I would argue these are the program responsibilities. Programs have to engage learners as partners in curricular and educational system design. They need to develop and communicate clear expected outcomes of the program. They need to individualize learning pathways where possible. They need to enable learners to own their own performance portfolio and use that information for their improvement, and actively seek and address bias in medical education, which is a huge issue beyond the scope I'm going to cover today. But real quickly, I just want to give you a heads up that the Macy Foundation held a 2-day conference in December on bias and assessment that has led to a series of papers that will be available in academic medicine this August. And so I encourage you to take a look at those. The program also has to optimize opportunities for learners to develop meaningful longitudinal relationships with patients, peers, and teachers, engage and support learners in that guided reflection and guided self-assessment. Again, enable the individualized learning plans. And then I would argue engage patients in formal teaching roles, right? Patients love to play in this space. They're awesome. And so how can we get them to be more of a partner with us in the educational process? One very simple thing, by the way, I used to do back when I was a real clinician, not anymore. But at the end of a visit, when I do direct observation, I'd simply ask the patient, did you get what you needed today? And if they did, I'd say like, well, tell me why that was. And if not, I say like, well, what can we do better? And so right there, they're helping us get better, right? Simple question, just at the end of visit, doesn't take long, it was just a couple of minutes. So in summary, I hope, and I know you all experienced this, but professional development is an intensely developmental process. So let's design programs that recognize this fact, right? Let's start to open up space for innovation. Again, wonderful conversation with Jeff about some of the wonderful work you're doing here in the last 2 days. Very excited about what's happening here in Colorado. I would argue co-production is a useful framework to guide and support professional development, including transitions, where learners become partners on this journey. They bring their expertise, they help the program get better as they themselves are developing professionally. And of course, patients and families must remain at the center of our work and transformation. But I do think we're also going to have to think not only about education, but healthcare as a co-produced service, and give folks the skills to be able to engage in co-production, like informed decision-making. Those are really important. Those communication skills, those soft skills, not so soft. You know, they have real impact and they affect outcomes. So it's been a real honor to be able to do this today. My gratitude to the Bertel family. I think we have some time for questions, and I would love to get your reactions and feedback. So thank you for having me.
Go ahead and open this up for questions from our audience.
Or I would welcome reflections, just some thoughts about what you heard.
That was great. Thank you so much. My name is Tyler Ansett. I'm a faculty member in the Division of Hospital Medicine. My reflection and question for you is, I think we can all agree, and I think you laid it out really nicely from the very beginning of the quintuple aim, that our current healthcare system is not one that we want to see propagated, and we want to see it better in the future. So can you talk a little bit about how the complexity of training people in a current system that we don't want them to be practicing in when they leave and in the future? So I feel like there's a tension there, in addition to is definitely not the system in which we trained or how we were trained. And I think there's some conflict and some tension there. I would appreciate your comments.
Yeah. Do you have an hour? Yeah, no, I think what you bring up is incredibly important. So we've definitely seen this shift in the healthcare system that I worry a lot about. And so the question is, you're preparing folks hopefully in an optimal way, and yet we're going to throw them into a system that may not be very receptive. And so I think part of the work for us is that folks are entering that system is also give them the skills to be able to make change in the system, even if it's kind of local change. That's part of the reason I didn't cover a lot of it today for why systems-based practice matters. You know, like, so they know how to system navigate, change that system navigation, engage in quality and so forth. And so those are going to be small cycles of change, right? They're not going to change the overall system. I think for those of us who are fortunate enough to be in leadership positions, I think we have an obligation to advocate for change, you know, and that's not easy. I mean, I don't know if you saw the recent editorial from Don Berwick about greed. I think that's a real issue. And so we've seen the corporatization of healthcare really accelerate. Believe it or not, Bud Relman in 1980 wrote an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine called The Medical Industrial Complex. And pretty much everything he put in that article, if you haven't read it, I'd recommend it, is come to pass. But in the end, physicians do have influence in the system, but we have to learn how to use it more collectively. And I think that's a big challenge for us. And so I'm heartened by some of the actions I'm seeing among the medical societies, like the Society for Hospital Medicine, ACP in particular, on the advocacy front. They've shifted their kind of focus. And you have to keep pushing, because you know better than I do, these things don't change overnight. It took a while for us to get into this state, and it's probably going to take a little bit of time. But I think that's something I take as a personal responsibility, being kind of locally active where I am in Pennsylvania, for example, and kind of healthcare policy at the state level. And so taking the time to make voices heard can at least get us started. I wish I had an easier answer for you. I think your question is profoundly important, but I don't think there's a single solution. I think it's going to be kind of multi-pronged. I hope that was helpful, but thank you for the question. Yeah, Mark.
So thanks for a terrific talk, Eric. So I have an observation I'd like you to respond to. Having watched education occur at a lot of levels, including my children, and heard this sort of vision for a tailored experience, my observation has been that that learners who struggle are often, not always, but often identified and given special resources. Those that are kind of at level, are sort of, it's like, this is working great, this is the way it should be. Those that are able to accelerate, I think, are the ones that most routinely are failed. That I would say, this would be my observation in medical education. I think it's pretty rare that we identify somebody who's doing fine and even coasting, and figuring out ways to actually challenge them in ways that, and so I'd be interested if, one, if you feel that's valid, and two, what would you do about it?
Oh, I think you raised some really important points. I think we have a system. It's what Lambert Schuworth, who's in Australia, he's done a lot of work on programmatic assessment, calls the deficiency model of medical education, where we put most of our resources into those who are struggling, and as long as nobody else is having trouble, we just kind of ignore them. And that comes at a heavy cost, because those folks aren't moving toward expertise in a way they could, because everybody needs support through that developmental process. And so partly what we're trying to accomplish here, and what we've also been trying to emphasize with the CCCs, is like, the CCC is not meant to be what we call a problem identification activity. Yes, it's important to identify folks early so we can help them. Everybody, though, should benefit, right? Should be more of a professional developmental mindset at the CCC, and everybody benefits through that process. And so, to your point, we want to make sure that, depending on where folks are, we can continue to help them, strive toward expertise and mastery. The other thing I didn't talk about, but Anders talks a lot about what he saw, particularly in medicine, when he got involved in medicine, is he termed it arrested development. That because they were coasting and doing okay, there wasn't effort put in to help move them, up the curve, and so they tended to plateau. And he's actually seen this phenomenon happen, and a lot of times it's because of the design of the program is not helping them engage in, example, deliberate practice, refinement, etc. Yeah, they're good enough, they're kind of doing okay, and so I don't have to worry about them. I'll shift my attention here. So that is a risk. I think that if we've got folks, that are accelerating in various areas, we actually could inadvertently hold them back. And Andrew said sometimes they even regress, because it gets a little bit to your question. They move into an environment that is less supportive, and so there's actually a regression that occurs. That's actually happening, by the way, in some of the accelerating change medical schools that engage in a systems curriculum. So they got this kind of wonderful, kind of advanced experience. What do you think happened when they moved into residency? They didn't have much of a receptor site. Basically, they were told, we don't have time for that. You're an intern. You need to just kind of crunch it, gut it out. Yeah, you'll maybe get to that in your second year. So here they are, prepared to be much better kind of system citizens, around discharge, et cetera. And they go into a particular residency program that says, we don't have time for that. And so guess what happens? And to your point, it starts to regress. So you know, those are all real risk if we only focus on the deficiencies, but at the same time, we don't prepare folks about, they may run into resistance. How do we help them manage that? Yeah.
Eric, thank you so much for coming. I wanted to go back to the slide that was about the opioid prescriptions.
Yeah.
Because my observation with that was that it was problematic that some people were prescribing way
Yeah.
above,
Yeah. I knew you'd pick
but
that
there
up.
were some that prescribed none. So their training program was failing on both ends. There were programs that failed on both sides.
Yep. You're absolutely right. Yeah. I only emphasize the kind of over prescribing, but under prescribing as a hospice and palliative care doc, you know, is also a big problem. And so the fact you see this kind of variation worries me. You know, I mean, some variation is probably understandable depending on who you're taking care of, but this is pretty significant variation. And you're right, the bottom end of that's not a good thing either. Yeah, thank you for that, Amos.
That's great. It is 1 o'clock. I wish we had more time, but so Dr. Humboldt, thank you very much for being here.
Yep, and I'll be around for questions afterwards with. Thank you so much.